Well, it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce Megan Basham to you. Many of you, I'm sure, know her for her best-selling book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for the Leftist Agenda. It's a truly amazing book. It treats many different subjects and how big money and big prestige offered by the left influenced many well-known evangelical leaders of various different types to shift their thinking, or at least their speaking anyway, from conservative biblical to progressive unbiblical on a wide variety of different subjects. Megan's book is an outstanding example of investigative journalism. I say that as one who was a newspaper reporter, editor, and publisher in the past, and the son of a newspaper reporter, editor, and publisher who did a great deal of investigative journalism that even led one time to the bombing of his newspaper office by a mafia boss after my dad exposed what led the FBI to convict him and put him in prison. At any rate, Megan and I have a little bit of background in common. She's not only the author of Shepherds for Sale, but also a culture reporter at the Daily Wire, previously with World Magazine and World News Group, where I had my longtime friend Joel Bells. And so we have that other connection. We've just been talking together. We never met face to face until just a few minutes ago. We've discovered other neat connections that we have. She previously served as entertainment editor and podcast co-host at World Magazine. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Telegraph, National Review, and she's appeared as a commentator on Fox News, MSNBC, the BBC, and the Today Show. You know from that she's got courage. She doesn't just go to friendly audiences. She goes wherever she has an opportunity to speak the truth. She's a former Novak Journalism Fellow and Claremont Lincoln Fellow of the Claremont Institute out in California, another place where I have connections and background and whose work I have admired for some 40 years. And she's the author of Beside Every Successful Man, There Is a Wife. A very fine book. And of course, Shepherds for Sale. She lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband, Brian, who is himself a broadcast journalist, and their two daughters. Welcome, Megan. Thank you so much for coming here. And I have to tell you of the courage this young woman has. She committed to doing this not long after she was first diagnosed with, was it stage 4 at that point?
It was stage 3, now it's stage 4. Yeah.
Colon cancer. And she has been through a variety of different operations since then, and people praying for her. But she made the commitment when she didn't know what sort of shape she would be in by now. So I am very grateful.
Thank you, sir.
We have excerpts from chapter 1 of her book, which she'll refer to. Available.
Yes, and I am currently no evidence of disease, so we're thanking God. Yeah. I will say though, if I have to pop a cough drop like halfway through my lecture because they took a chunk of my lung out a couple of months ago, so I might have to rely on a cough drop here or there, but hopefully that won't come up. So I wanted to thank you all so much for having me. I was told that I had an hour, which you can tell us Southern Baptists, they have an hour. That's a little like we're just getting warmed up. So I will try to stay on schedule though. Since Shepherds for Sale became a bestseller, I have suddenly gone from being a mostly unknown journalist to being invited to come speak at events like this. And I'm kind of developing a few standard talks that I give, and it's centered on my reporting in Shepherds for Sale. But when Cal asked me if I would come and speak at this event, and speak to the Cornwall Alliance conference, I knew that I was going to have to write something fresh and new just for this conference. Because while officially the title of this talk is A Moses versus Pharaoh Story, How and Why the Cornwall Alliance Defeated Progressive Creation Care and Why It Matters, in my mind, the real title is Why It's Cal Beisner's Fault I Ended Up in This Mess. And it's an apt title that hopefully we'll come to see as we go through some of this material. Now, I'm not a scientist, and I don't play one on TV, but I am married to someone who has played a scientist on TV. In fact, just right here in Memphis. My husband was a morning meteorologist at WHBQ for a number of years, and we loved our time in Memphis, and we speak of it very fondly. But because he was a meteorologist, I didn't really need to be a scientist. So when my scientist husband told me that there were a lot of reasons to be skeptical of climate change alarmism, like a good Southern Baptist complementarian, I just believed him. So I didn't need to ask any more questions. Okay, husband says there's good reason to doubt it, I doubt it. But the Cornwall Alliance, when I started researching the material, armed me with really good reasons to be skeptical of the climate alarmism claims. And that, did the thing where my husband went, okay, so you won't listen to me, but you will listen to this man, Cal Beisner, that we don't even know. And that's typical in a marriage, I think. But while I don't have particular expertise in science, I do have a lot of expertise in journalism, including investigative journalism. And a key focus of my reporting for the last few years has been how secular left-wing foundations have infiltrated evangelical ministries in order to promote progressive policy goals. So that has manifested itself in a lot of different ways in a lot of different subjects, and I talk about all of that in the book. And I break it down on issues that I think are biblically debatable issues on which Christians can, in good faith, disagree, and then progress to other issues that I don't believe are biblically debatable. Now, climate change kind of fell in that somewhat biblically debatable bucket, but it was one of the first issues on which I think the left really realized that they wanted to target evangelicals specifically. So the climate change issue and how these left-wing foundations that are secular and not Christian target the church offers a really good blueprint to how they're viewing that in many different areas. So I think it can be human nature to sort of fail to see what's happening in our own era right in front of our faces. And it helps to look back at a different point in history to see where something similar happened, because we can learn a lot from that. And so for that reason, I'd like to start by looking back at history a little bit before we get to what's happening today. So back in the 1930s to 1950s, the Communist Party was intent on destroying Western democracy from the inside. So Soviet spies set about infiltrating America's most culturally important institutions. So we know that they tried to infiltrate the government. We know that they tried to infiltrate, and successfully did, academia and Hollywood. But what isn't talked about very often is how they set about infiltrating the church. So before he went to work for the Reagan administration, ex-communist Herbert Weinstein testified before Congress on the long lists that he and his comrades compiled of the people and organizations that they planned to target for exploitation. And they called these their suckers lists. And there was one group, Romerstein said, who were the biggest suffers of them all: pastors. Because he said that communist operatives had more success infiltrating their ranks than that of any other group. So that's including academia, including Hollywood. Pastors and churches were where they found their most success. According to later declassified records, American communists acting under Soviet orders founded the front group, the American Peace Mobilization, and its particular goal was to convince religious leaders to promote the Kremlin's aims. So in 1941, it successfully enlisted pastors to lobby FDR to keep America out of World War II, because at that time, Stalin and Hitler were actually allies. This group published an open letter in the New York Times telling the president, and I would say rather presumptuously telling the president, We of the church stand firmly opposed to any unjust war. Now, Congress would later call the American Peace Mobilization, quote, one of the most seditious organizations which ever operated in the United States. And pastors claiming to speak for the church supported this. Illustrating just how little is new under the sun here, the New York Times also did its part to provide cover for this Soviet engineer group, referring to it simply with the innocuous descriptor of a group of clergymen. So this infiltration had generational impact. Today, the Episcopal Church ranks as one of the Protestant denominations that I would say has most departed from biblical Christianity. Its beautiful buildings today tend to be draped in flags like this. Now, I think it's important to remember this history because we're seeing eerily similar parallels to events that are happening today. Mainline churches have largely died out since the 1950s, and they don't have a lot of cultural influence anymore. And I would say that is because people tend to abandon whitewashed tombs. So if you're an evangelical, if you're here today, it's probably because you are not mainline. You probably are more likely today to identify as an evangelical. So just to check, how many here identify as an evangelical today? So almost everyone, yeah. Now, if you are an evangelical, it makes you part of the largest religious group in the country. You represent roughly 30% of the American electorate, and you have rightly been called by even left-leaning publications like The Atlantic, America's most powerful voting bloc. You care a lot about issues like religious liberty, protecting the unborn, and maintaining biblical norms for gender and sexuality. You don't always win at the ballot box, but you do present the greatest hurdle to a Leftist agenda that opposes all of those things. So if you look at nearly any issue that represents a key priority for the left, whether it's lax border policies, the LGBTQ agenda, enshrining a quote-unquote right to kill the unborn, you will find that even when every other major religious group has signed on, evangelicals will remain the lone holdout. So just a couple of examples of that. Even at the height of the BLM movement, when everyone was posting those black squares and marching in the streets, evangelicals were still, and this headline, you will see them do this a lot. They will emphasize white evangelicals because it's a way to imply something that is actually not true. Like when you look at the studies on how evangelicals feel about sexuality and the fact that they still oppose Obergefell and they still want traditional marriage, they believe in the biblical definition of marriage, they oppose someone claiming a different gender identity. They will emphasize that white evangelicals believe this, and I think that that is a way to try to minimize and try to suggest that it is a racial issue when it isn't, because actually Black and Hispanic evangelicals tend to pull even more strongly on defining marriage as between one man and one woman. So that's kind of a little manipulation you will sometimes see in media, but they did that here. So at the height of the Me Too, of the Black Lives Matter movement, evangelicals were still the most likely, at 72%, to say that seeing racism where it doesn't exist is a bigger problem than not addressing racism. And evangelicals were the only religious group that said that. Evangelicals are also the last religious voting bloc standing on marriage and sexuality. So 61% of us say that the Bible's prohibition against homosexuality still applies today. And even now, 10 years after Obergefell, only 34% of evangelicals support gay marriage. That is huge. We are really the only major religious bloc for who that is now true. Even Muslims are more supportive now of gay marriage than evangelicals. So essentially, you're the only voting bloc that has not shifted its allegiance from Jesus Christ to forming milk. So in short, if the Democratic Party could manage to shave off even 10 to 20 points of evangelical support, it would face virtually no serious opposition to its agenda. And I believe that that explains the efforts left-wing organizations have been going to today to bend evangelicals to their political will. So just like the main line said yesterday, today evangelicals are the key target. You are the target. So the question, I think, then, is why, just like 70 years ago, so many well-known evangelical institutions and leaders have been promoting causes and issues that no plain reading of Scripture would demand. I'm thinking of things like advocating for net zero fossil fuel regulations. Meanwhile, the issues that unequivocally call for Christian clarity, like the trans ideology that has been devouring our kids, has so often found them stymied and silent. And to give you an example of how so many pastors have started to focus on causes that are either biblically debatable or in fact in direct opposition to Scripture, I think we can look at some examples that I cite in my book. And one is actually a friend of mine who is more politically progressive than I am, but she's in the Christian Reformed Church. And a few years ago, she sent me a text. She was infuriated. It was right around Christmas. And she had received an Advent devotional from her pastor. Its theme was climate change for Christmas, climate change. And these are just a couple of the entries in that devotional. And I'm quoting directly, so this is not editorializing or paraphrasing. Well, we don't have to look far to see injustice, to see creation groaning under the weight of the climate crisis and environmental destruction, and to see people turning away from seeing and addressing these realities. And then another entry in one of these devotionals for Christmas. It can be hard to find joy today, especially when we allow the reality of the role our actions play in our changing climate to sink in. So really Christmassy stuff right up there with Away in a Manger, Oh Holy Night. So as I said, this is not editorializing, this is verbatim. And my friend asked me a question, which I think was a very good question to ask. Why would my pastor even think to do this? What motivated him to send out a climate change themed Advent devotional? And I think when we're asking a question like that, it is always good to start with some tried and true journalistic advice. And it's one that my friend Kelly Colbert, who is here today, has especially exemplified for me. Some of you may remember it from this movie. Does anybody know this movie and what its famous tagline was? Follow the money. That is right. So a couple of decades ago, because it takes a while to march through institutions, some foundations funded by secular billionaires began to take a serious interest in overcoming this problem of evangelical resistance. And the solution they came up with was something called AstroTurf. Now, if you're not familiar with that term as it's used in journalism and politics, what it simply means is to create the appearance of a grassroots movement. So it's a form of manipulation in which powerful organizations and individuals will use influential personalities to do things like give interviews and publish essays claiming to speak for your group. And the idea is to convince you that everyone else in your group agrees with this position. So if you don't want to be thought unintelligent or disreputable or unloving or even unchristian, then you need to adopt that position too. Now, one artifact of this interest in overcoming evangelical resistance that we have from 2012 goes back to a program director with George Soros' Open Society Foundation. And I put these memos up so that people can see them in their, natural format. So you can see the highlighting. It may be a little hard to read, but I think it's important because sometimes when I come to these talks, people understandably are skeptical, and they should be skeptical, and they wonder, is this exaggerated? Did this really happen? So I like to put the memos up so that you can see it yourself, and feel free to take a screenshot of that and to read it later if you want in its entirety. But this memo from George Soros' Open Society Foundation in 2012 focused on the role of religion in public life. So the head of George Soros' Open Society Foundation at that time acknowledged in this memo that faith's influence in the U.S. is powerful and here to stay. And he also acknowledged that his group would never be able to achieve its policy goals without the buy-in of Christians. So what this organization, again, was founded by a left-wing atheist, planned to do was to, quote, leverage strategies that engage faith-based communities in advocacy and mobilization. The memo also laid out a plan for harnessing the power of the church that included investing in strategic communications work and awarding fellowships to faith-based thinkers. So in other words, what Open Society, which again is Soros, planned to start doing was spreading a lot of money around to Christian types to spread their preferred messages to AstroTurf. Now, this memo also expressly planned to exploit what it called generational divides among Christians. So the memo said this: the differences of opinion on public policies that exist between younger and older evangelicals will help our grantees build greater support for issues such as economic equity, climate change, immigrants' rights, LGBT equality, and reproductive health. Really Christian issues there. So if you're a parent or a grandparent here today and you're wondering, why your kids or grandkids have started to tell you that the Bible doesn't have anything to say about issues like abortion or homosexuality, there's a decent chance that George Soros might have had something to do with that. And if we were going to spend our time today talking about the many, many millions that all of these secular left-wing foundations have poured into Christian institutions to try to move evangelicals politically, we could be here all day, and I would have to pass the baton to Kelly Culver halfway through it to cover all of that. But we don't have time for that, so we're going to focus on this issue of climate change. And what you will know is that the same basic blueprint and strategy has applied to any number of issues. And climate change, I would say, was the first issue that they very strongly focused on, and it can give us a model for how we respond to maybe other issues as well. And it will hopefully encourage us to have some healthy skepticism when we see it happening, not just on the issue of climate change, but on these other issues. So population control has always been a particular interest to the hard left faction of the environmentalist movement. And now it's particularly true of one of the nation's top abortion funders, the Hewlett Foundation, which has given Planned Parenthood alone, so just one abortion organization, over $100 million since the year 2000. So a lot of murdered babies represented by that $100 million. In the early 2010s, the Hewlett Foundation joined the Clinton Initiative and pouring millions into groups like the Christian Coalition and the Evangelical Environmental Network for their climate change initiatives. And the Evangelical Environmental Network is the one that we're going to mostly focus on today. But it wasn't the only group to whom they were funneling money for the cause of promoting climate change policies within the church. So in 2015, the George Soros and Bill Gates funded think tank, New America, released a report on these efforts by the Hewlett Foundation and others to get climate change legislation passed. They were hoping to learn from what worked and what didn't. And here you can see just one of those grants. So in the early 2000s, again, Hewlett joined the Clinton Foundation and others. They're pouring this money in. And this is just one of those grants. It's for $150,000 in this case, but there were many, many more. I believe this one was for 2017. So it's just one quick example of dozens and dozens that I could give you. But this illustrates that those who are telling you that it's not happening, it is happening. We have the receipts, we have the documentation, we can see in their own financial records that they are doing this. So back to the New America report. In 2015, this think tank, New America, that is funded by people like Bill Gates and George Soros, released a report on these efforts to mobilize evangelicals to get climate change legislation passed. At that time, they were particularly interested in cap and trade legislation. And this report was something of an autopsy. They were trying to look at what worked and what didn't. Now, their big problem was that 30% of the electorate who identifies as evangelical is, once again, the most resistant to climate change panic. Because, again, we're stubborn. We tend to not go along with the flow. And I think there's a very good biblical reason for that. But only 34% of us believe that climate change is a very serious problem. And you can see that we are really the only Christian group and only religious group that is still skeptical of climate change policies. We're the most skeptical group, backed by 12 points. We are also by far the least likely to buy that human activity is primarily responsible for climate change. And because of this, and because we have a book that tells us how the world is actually going to end, and it tells us that not a sparrow falls from the sky without God seeing it, we're not given to panic. And I think that you see that reflected in these numbers, and that is why evangelical Christians have not moved in the direction of these other religious groups. Now, the fact that we won't move is a problem for those who want free citizens to give up some of their freedom in exchange for the possibility of lowering the temperature 2 or 3 degrees. So you have to find ways to convince the church to either embrace this cause or to soften its stance if you want to get something like cap and trade or other fossil fuel restrictions passed. So New America's report noted that the strategy of the environmentalists, and again, this is their report, so we're quoting from their documentation. Their report noted that their strategy was to recruit elite evangelicals who would then use their influence to give spiritual legitimacy to specific climate change policies. So their hope was that this advocacy for this kind of legislation would then be trickled down, that's their term, trickled down to ordinary Christians in the pews. So what the climate change activists wanted was to use evangelical leaders, trusted organizations who know the lingo, to persuasively sell the message to what would otherwise be a pretty unreceptive audience. The author of New America's report explained in an interview that the object was to, quote, collect strange bedfellows and to sort of sneakily break down the faith coalition from the inside and give cover to Republican members of Congress to support climate action. It's political in nature. This isn't theological in nature. We're not having a spiritual discussion here. When they talk about why they're funding these efforts, it is specifically to move evangelicals politically. So how do they do this? Well, first, just like Ramerstein and his comrades, step one was adopting churchy-sounding language. So many evangelicals had correctly sized up the names of the environmental movement and found it biblical. They saw that it ascribed animals, the same worth as humans. Ingrid Newkirk, I'm going to guess other people are aware of this quote, and she was the founder of PETA and is also a well-known environmental activist. And she famously said, a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. So no difference in moral worth between these different creatures that God created. Evangelicals also tended to see the movement's close ties to New Age earth worship. So these secular left foundations were not going to be able to sell environmentalism as a cause to them unless they gave it a new name. Environmentalism thus became climate care or creation care, because who doesn't want to care for the climate and creation? We all want that. And if all it was meant by that were things like planting trees or other reasonable conservation efforts, I don't think that anyone here today would probably object to that. So that was step one, a branding campaign. And then step two, and again, this is their own terminology, was to rent some evangelicals. Rent just meant find some well-known evangelical leaders to act as mascots for their cause. And I just want to read a little bit, because it can be hard to see this. I'll read a little bit from this report. From 2000 to 2004, the EEN slowly laid the groundwork for national evangelical institutions to grasp climate change as a moral issue. The EEN strategy was to integrate climate care into the core of the evangelical subculture by building a bench of national evangelical elites who framed climate change as a moral issue and called for decisive policy action. So one of their first recruits was Christianity Today magazine. We know that that's pretty good. If you're looking for a mascot, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, founded by Willie Graham back in, I think, 1953, that's a pretty good mascot. Another one that they looked at and recruited was vice president of the National Association of Evangelicals. That's a group that represents 45,000 churches in about 40 different denominations. It was once so theologically conservative that they welcomed President Ronald Reagan to their 1983 convention, where he gave his famous Evil Empire speech. So that's another really effective mascot if you're looking to move evangelicals. So the National Association of Evangelicals VP, Richard Cizik, joined the Evangelical Environmental Network, and he was then catapulted to fame in something that I have come to think of as the strange new respect phenomenon. It's basically the legacy mainstream media will only positively recognize a Christian if they are suddenly taking a position that would seem to go against what the other Christians think. And suddenly the media will have a strange new respect for that person. And so they had strange new respect for Cizik. And that landed him on the cover, on his new spread on Vanity Fair. So you can see this compelling image here of him in a blasted landscape. I'm not sure what the owl represents, but this was the picture that ended up at Vanity Fair. He was on a list of climate heroes in that issue, the green issue. And he had very good company. He was with Bette Midler and Bono's wife and Arnold Schwarzenegger, so he's suddenly in very elite company here. And this core group then recruited other evangelicals to their cause. So they recruited people like Rick Warren. And I'm assuming everyone's familiar with Rick Warren, the pastor recently retired, a Saddleback and author of The Purpose Driven Life. They recruited the head of the Salvation Army, the president of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which represents some 185 member schools, including schools like Wheaton and Baylor and Biola. So these were really good people to pull into the project if you're trying to move evangelicals. And so that brings me to step 3 of the AstroTurf strategy. You want to make your elite and minority cause seem grassroots and mainstream. And to that end, the Evangelical Environmental Network published, and remember what we talked about with Romerstein, which should sound a little familiar, it published an open letter in the New York Times. And it was signed by these 86 evangelical luminaries, including the presidents of 39 Christian colleges. Just like the Episcopalians in the 1940s, this letter left no room for theological debate. It simply states starkly that evangelicals must engage this issue without any further lingering over the basic reality of the problem. So they were saying that evangelical Christians had a Christian obligation to take up this issue. And yet, the crux of this letter's ask, and it was buried within a lot of vague generalizations about loving your neighbors and some overwrought but unsourced claims like millions of people could die in this century because of climate change. Buried in that was this: the most important immediate step that can be taken at the federal level is to pass and implement national legislation requiring sufficient economy-wide reductions in carbon dioxide emissions, such as a cap and trade program. So even though this wore the garment, the clothing of something that looks like it is theological in nature, it was actually political in nature. They were lobbying to get that cap and trade legislation passed. Also, as part of this AstroTurf campaign, just as we saw in Romerstein's era, other favorably trumpeted the fact that evangelical leaders wanted climate change action. So you publish the letter, you say, this is what evangelicals want. The media then run a lot of favorable stories saying, this is what evangelicals want. And your Republican congressman, who relies on those evangelical votes to stay in office, gets the message, this is what evangelicals want. I better back this cap and trade policy. So in the 9 years since that report, the Evangelical Environmental Network has had some success, I would say, in convincing evangelical institutions to take up their cause. Why they've had more success, we'll get to here in just a little bit. But their process of infiltration and AstroTurf that I just described in the early 2010s is still going on today. These grants are still being dispersed, and there have actually been some new players added to this grant machine. For example, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. It is the largest charitable foundation in Silicon Valley, and it's heavily bankrolled by Mark Zuckerberg and Netflix co-founder Reed Hastings and a few other tech titans. In 2024, the most recent filing available, it gave the Evangelical Environmental Network $1.5 million. You should ask the Cornwall Alliance if they're getting any money like that.
No.
So they received, this is just one of the grants from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And they have given, in that same year that they gave the $1.5 million to the Evangelical Environmental Network, they also gave 6 different grants to various groups for reproductive rights. So, of course, the euphemism for abortion, we continue to see this marriage of environmental activism with abortion activism. In fact, one of the grantees that Silicon Valley Foundation gave to that same year that they would donate to the EEN was URGE, which stands for Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, and it describes itself as a collective of queer, trans, and non-binary people working to infuse reproductive justice principles and values throughout our work. So I think this is another way that we see climate change alarmism kind of married to an effort to reduce the population. In this case, not just through abortion, but also through promoting perverse sexual practices that are by nature sterile. They're not going to produce children. So during the Biden administration, the biggest grant maker in the world then also got involved in this effort to move evangelicals on the issue of climate change. The federal government began to fund these faith-based organizations. So in 2022, the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration announced his intention to, quote, use faith-based organizations to potentially host climate and equity roundtables. Now, Dr. Rick Spinrad at NOAA shared that he had already had multiple discussions with the faith community about how it could help the Biden-Harris administration address these threats of climate change. Though he admitted that turning to churches wasn't initially part of his strategy, he then recognized that part of NOAA's organizational construct going forward would be that the agency would build these partnerships and channels with the faith-based community, particularly evangelicals, into its communication DNA. So now we have not just secular left foundations interested in moving evangelicals on this issue, but also funding coming from the federal government, so your taxpayer dollars. So Spinrad was as good as his word. In 2023, just one example, NOAA gave nearly $400,000 in your taxpayer money to Creation Justice Ministries for a project titled Participatory Education in Faith Communities for Climate Resilience. You always have these sort of, tongue twister, extensive names. But again, what it means is we want to root evangelicals for the cause of climate change. Now, this grant noted that its purpose was to build networks of faith communities educated on the realities of climate change, and they were going to do that with a group called Interfaith Power and Light Partners. And again, one example, tens of millions of grants going to these types of programs within ministries and churches as part of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. In fact, that was the largest climate change legislation in history. It's supposed to be about reducing inflation, but in fact, it dedicated approximately $370 billion to the issue of climate change. So that is the money flow going from the federal government now into these evangelical institutions. But what does the actual activity these activists look like on the ground? Well, fortunately, New America covered that. They included in their report what the Interfaith Power and Light does and what its activists do on the ground. One of the people that they're particularly interested in was the nation's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. Because if you can boom the Southern Baptist Convention, which is known as being very conservative, then you'll get a lot of bang for your buck on evangelicals, because a lot of evangelicals are in Southern Baptist churches and they don't even know it. So New America said that just, and I'm quoting from them here, that even just neutralizing the Southern Baptist Convention could disrupt the solid Republican opposition to jabber trade. So What they described is how this money coming from the government and secular left foundations was going into these ostensibly Christian groups and how they are then going into denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention. And one of the examples the New America report gave was a climate change activist named Alexis Chase, and then described how she carried out this work. Now, Chase is an Episcopal priest in Atlanta who has had extensive experience merging progressive political activism with her ministerial role. As a member of the clergy known as the Marriage Militia Project, she has boasted that she has helped marry as many homosexual couples in the church as possible in a bid to help increase evangelical acceptance of same-sex marriage. But in this case, with Interfaith Power and Light, she was discussing how she worked on climate change activism, not or LGBTQ activism. So she described how she successfully convinced a group of Southern Baptist lay leaders in 5 Southern Baptist Georgia churches to lobby to stop plans for 3 coal-powered plants in Georgia. So her strategy in one word is very easy to describe: subterfuge. So this is what she said. First, motivated lay leaders. So she's talking about church members who are in the church who want to bring the issue of climate change into their evangelical congregation. These motivated lay leaders would invite Chase to teach a general creation care class to a small group or Bible study within the church, because that sounds inexpensive. Creation care Bible study, sure, why not? I do think that when you look at Chase, it does raise the question of why we have pastors who would not be a little bit skeptical when a female Episcopal priest who is an activist on gay marriage wants to come in and teach a class on climate change, why they would allow that. That's a different conversation, but I think when your pastor is allowing something like that, it's important to ask some questions and determine, should we be turning over our small group classes to someone who is not a member of our church and who holds positions that the doctrine we disagree with to teach something like creation care. So when she would teach this class, Chase said that she would suggest some presentations on how to lower energy bills that allowed her to disguise their ultimate lobbying aims. So at the end of the class, she gave those assembled phone numbers to call and register complaints about the coal plants. The report said, partly as a result, 2 proposed coal-fired plant projects were shut down completely. But the policy campaign, and I'm quoting from their material, this isn't me, but the policy campaign was smuggled into the class as an extension of personal discipleship. So just to say that again, the policy campaign was smuggled into a discipleship class. So knowing so, it doesn't have to be smuggled. Sometimes it's welcomed right in the front door. So Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary is the nation's 3rd largest seminary in the country. It educates pastors from every evangelical denomination. So even if you are not Southern Baptist, you should actually hear what's happening in these Southern Baptist seminaries, because they do educate a plurality of all Protestant pastors in the U.S. So it bills itself as theologically conservative. But it's been particularly active in promoting climate change legislation to students, welcoming the same climate alarmists like EEN advisor Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who also appear in the World Economic Forum, and obviously she also hangs out at events with people like Barack Obama and Leonardo DiCaprio and other climate change activists like that. So she has been welcomed to campus to speak to the Southeastern Seminary students. In 2022, Southeastern welcomed another climate change activist, Professor Jonathan Moo, a professor of environmental studies, and he was there to give a guest lecture titled "How to Love Our Neighbor in the Midst of the Climate Crisis." So in this lecture, Moo claimed that environmental activism is a necessary part of being faithful to the gospel. So environmental activism, necessary part, being faithful to the gospel. He said the United States bears the lion's share of guilt on climate change because of how rich and prosperous our use of fossil fuels has made us. And he told the students that Americans are especially obligated to sacrifice by adopting emission restricting policies. So these are the kind of policies that are making everything from gas to groceries more expensive for those neighbors that we're supposed to be loving. Now, if Moo adding new environmental requirements to the gospel wasn't shocking enough, he also suggested that these students purchase indulgences for their climate sins, like traveling by airplane. In particular, he suggested that they buy carbon credits from the environmentalist group Arosha, which is an EEN partner, and Moo just happens to sit on their board. And I don't know if you guys have, I'm sure you have talked about how the climate change alarmists are particularly interested in killing off cattle and destroying family farms. And I can't help you notice irony that he's named Dr. Moo. And I just kind of love that. God has a sense of humor. So Moo sits on Arosha's board. He's encouraging the seminary students to buy carbon credits from Arosha. And a lot of you may not be familiar with this organization. It's international and it is very active in the United States. And just to tell you a little bit about it, it brands itself as a Christian ministry, but it also gets money from secular foundations like the Annenberg Foundation, which also funds a national abortion rights action league. It also funds Planned Parenthood and Center for Reproductive Rights. So once again, we see that marriage of climate change activism and a desire to reduce the population for abortion. Arosha is well aware, by the way, of how some of its funders are activating and spreading money around to promote quote-unquote reproductive rights, and they don't seem especially bothered by that because their recently retired executive director, Ben Glow, he's doing something else now, and just until the last couple of years, I believe he was still with Arosha. He ran for Congress as a Democrat, and he assured voters that despite claiming to be personally pro-life, he would not support overturning Roe v. Wade. So we have Christian leaders who claim to be personally pro-life, who are activists on climate change, locking arms with pro-abortion organizations. Then we can look at Arosha's strange hymns and prayers that sound a lot more like Marxist Gaia worship, I think, than any lowly Christian. So this is one of the prayers that Arosha has recommended congregations pray together. I'd like to listen to it and see if you feel like you could imagine your congregation praying anything like this. Its prayers are for ecological violence, to repent from ecological violence, and to repent from humanity acting like parasites. It suggests praying for the courage to speak out against increased nuclear capability and lamenting America's exploited economic system. I'm going to read a little bit of one of their recommended prayers that they sent out to churches, and it's called, "Woe to the Unholy Trinity." Imagine praying this together on a Sunday morning. "We have acted as cheerleaders and chaplains to the unholy Trinity, and so we name the unholy beast. We repent of it. Capitalism, consumerism, individualism, the unholy Trinity that oppresses the poor and ransacks the earth." So I think you have to wonder if ordinary Southern Baptists, what they would have thought of this had they realized that their unholy capitalist ties, which go to help support Southeastern Seminary, were being used within the lecture fees for a representative from Arosha, who then used his time to do illuminated capitalist perpetrating himself. The question that we do have to ask is the degree to which humans are impacting the climate an issue on which Christians can in good faith disagree? I do think that it is. I think it will create some theological problems that you'll have to answer for if you believe that mankind is capable of destroying creation in that manner, but I think it is an issue on which we can agree to charitably disagree. The problem is when schools like Southeastern invite someone in and they are having a panel or they're having a conference and it's presenting only one view. I think the problem is demanding a consensus on the subject by abusing and manipulating scripture. And I think the problem is requiring students, when they're supposed to be educated in the full breadth of Christian thought, to sign on to only one point of view on this issue. And I think, it's a little convenient that it just so happens to be the same view that aligns with nearly every major corporation, A-list Hollywood, academia, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and the most powerful progressive foundations on earth. I think at that point, it seems a little less like debating a debatable issue and a little more like we're turning our temples over to money changers. In this case, maybe I should say the carbon traders. Because the problem is, while we've been told again and again that we must embrace these policies to show that we love our neighbors, it's worth pointing out research that shows that a lot of this climate change activism and their rhetoric has been fairly detrimental to our neighbors. It's driving an epidemic of fear and despair among young people. It's giving rise to a new term, eco-anxiety. One 2021 study conducted by 5 UK universities surveyed 10,000 young people between the ages of 16 and 25 in 10 different countries, including the United States. It found that nearly 60% of these young people think that humanity is doomed because of climate change. Nearly half said that their fears of the environment, are negatively impacting their mental health on a daily basis. Perhaps if people like Moo and Heo want the church to offer a distinctively Christian witness, which is what they've said on the issue of climate change, they can consider what words of calm assurance rooted in a loving God and his stable creation would mean to generations who are deeply anxious about climate change, to the point that we are seeing crashing birth rates because so many of them say they don't even want to have children because they have been successfully brainwashed into thinking they are bringing children into a dying world. Okay, so I gave you 3 ways that secular funders have brought this issue of climate change into the church through an astroturf strategy that relied on the same thing that Raumerstein's communist comrades did. A branding campaign that uses churchy language. Capturing evangelical mascots who will then promote climate change alarmism so it trickles down to the pews, and then a media campaign that makes it look as if most reasonable evangelicals agree with the consensus, and you're kooky and you're fringe if you don't agree with that consensus. So those 3 things created this problem. So now I think we need to look at 3 things that can fix the infiltration and astroturf problem. And that brings us back to the secret title of my book, Why It's Hal Beiser's Fault I Became So Controversial. So when I started writing Shepherds for Sale, climate change was actually the first chapter that I worked on, and it's the first chapter in the book, not including the introduction. And what that meant was that Hal Beiser was one of the first people that I interviewed. And he was the epitome of the happy warrior who was not even slightly ashamed of his positions. And that inspired me to be unapologetic. And I won't listen, he's not to blame for my combative personality, but he's not to blame for what I do on Twitter. But his courage gave me courage. Just listening to him describe how he faced down some of these massive organizations was incredibly inspiring to me. And it encouraged me to be unapologetic about my project of exposing money and influences coming into the church to move Christians for political agendas that are either diametrically opposed to Scripture or at least are debatable. So not only did I need to interview Cal then, I also had to research Cal. And that is how I learned that this mild-mannered professor was such a formidable foe that he had become the scourge of some of the largest and most powerful foundations in the world. And who doesn't want to emulate that? When all of these powerful progressive NGOs started pouring these millions of dollars into the Evangelical Environmental Network to get that fossil fuel legislation passed, they identified Cal, one man, as their primary obstacle. And I mean, can you blame them? Look at him, he's terrifying. That report from New America noted with frustration that Cal Beiser's efforts, those persistent efforts, entirely stymied their astroturf campaign in the early to mid 2000s. Said the author of that report during an interview about why the Evangelical Environmental Network's efforts failed. She said this: A single guy named Cal Weisner was able to pull a coalition together fairly easily. And what's amazing to me is the Cornwall Alliance, for most of the period of question that he was leading this anti-climate action movement among evangelicals and conservatives, he wasn't even doing it full time. He was teaching classes full time at a Christian university and doing this as a hobby. So and I'm still quoting from her, so I don't want you to think that evangelical creation here lost out because the Koch brothers poured a bunch of money into stopping it and they were washed out. This effort wasn't well resourced. It didn't take very much. Now, Cal might beg to differ on how much it took, but at least from the perception of New America, they were very much dealing with a David figure. So what did Cal do? And really, I should just turn over the mic at this point. I'm going to tell you what he did, but I'll tell you from my point of view what he did. So first, he and his co-laborers on this issue were willing to sound the alarm, and they were willing to be confrontational in love. So that's one. And that kind of sounds like an abstract point, but it isn't. It required concrete action. So what it looked like in this case was they reached out to the National Association of Evangelicals, which was being drafted, again, Richard Cizik, the cool Vanity Fair picture, into this effort. And they put together a list of biblical and scientific arguments for why this incredibly influential evangelical organization should not sign the initial public letter that the EEN wanted to publish in the New York Times. Now, this letter that Cal and his friends sent to the NEE did not demand wholesale rejection of the notion that climate change is, at least in part, caused by human activity. But it did argue that the cause, severity, and solution to climate change should be a matter of Christian liberty. Some of the NEE's own members were among the signers of Cal's letter, or Cornwall Alliance's letter, urging their leaders not to adopt any official position on the issue of climate change because love for the Creator and respect for the creation, respect for His creation does not require us to take a position. So they were combating legalism. Now, most of all, these dissenters pointed out that biblically there is no clear mandate to spread the gospel of climate change. Evangelicals, they said, are to be first and foremost messengers of the good news of the gospel to a lost and dying world. We are to promote those things that please God and oppose those things in the world that clearly violate His righteous standard of conduct. Climate change clearly did not meet this standard. And in fact, though the NAE would go on to become deeply involved with the climate change movement, I believe that at that time, Cornwall Alliance, and at this time as well, was incredibly effective in slowing down that momentum. And obviously, New America and these secular foundations thought so as well. So the Cornwall Alliance also released a public letter of their own to combat the letter that had been published in the New York Times and was hailed in so many of those media reports. Now, that letter said that they agreed with the EEN's positions that Christians are called to love their neighbors and to act as faithful stewards over the earth. But given conflicting expert opinion, and they highlighted that there actually is conflicting expert opinion, they rejected the assertion that Christians should be spiritually guilted into promoting counter trade legislation. So that's one. You have to be willing to lovingly confront legalism. And I think it's a little bit of a problem that when we talk about legalism, we tend to imagine it as something conservative, that it comes for people who tend to be more politically conservative. But all legalism is adding man-made rules to Scripture. So that is clearly what this climate change movement was doing. It was adding a new man-made mandate to the gospel. So two, Cal and Cornwall have been very wise about avoiding the corporate mindset. Okay, so what do I mean by that? They have a clear mission, and they have managed to achieve a sort of David versus Goliath story because they gathered not just impressive leadership, but wise and doctrinally sound leadership. Now, sometimes I think it can be useful to offer a negative example of what you mean in a different context to help highlight how this applies itself in real life. So I'm going to paint a picture that of what it looks like when evangelical leadership is impressive but not faithful. And in this case, it's on another topic that I worked on in my reporting, and I think it will be illustrative. So a couple of years ago, I had set up an interview with a man who sits on the board of a global Christian charity that connects churches and ministries with opportunities to care for children and orphans. Now, before this man retired, he had an incredibly successful career in Fortune 500 corporate America. So, think somebody at the pinnacle of some of these very large companies, C-suite. Given his faith and his work with an explicitly Christian organization, I asked him about, at that time, a new Biden administration rule that required foster families to use a child's identified pronouns and chosen name, and to allow children to dress in a manner that they believe reflects their self-identified gender identity and expression. So you can see the text of that Biden-era foster care rule here. And what it essentially meant was that if a girl believes she's a boy, the Christian foster care parent would be required to treat her as a boy. In fact, that rule said that foster families had to commit to establishing an environment that supports the child's LGBTQ status or identity. So that was language that could have even potentially meant providing puberty blockers to the child, providing some sort of surgery to the child, things that no Christian would ever want to do as a foster care parent. And I also want to note on this issue, it is still very much a live issue. It's still going on in states like Oregon and California and Massachusetts, I think. And so there's really wonderful groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom right now planning to get this to the Supreme Court. But clearly, it's an issue in which Christian voices should be unequivocal and absolutely needed to be heard. And so I asked this man, how, given that evangelicals adopt at 5 times the rate of the general population and 65% of foster parents attend church weekly, how was this rule going to affect vulnerable children? Because the Christian family cannot commit to that standard, would they then not be able to be foster care parents? And that is what has been happening. So this man gave what I would say was an extremely safe corporate answer to that question. He told me that if faith-based individuals were excluded from adoption, this country would not need to be able to take care of children at the current level, and also told me that the child's care and nurture should be the priority, not these other issues of gender and sexuality. Wasn't what I was hoping for from the head of a Christian organization, but it was fine, it was mild, I planned to use it. And yet, even that, he decided, was too risky. Later that night, I received an email asking me not to use any portion of our conversation that seemed to address the LGBT community, as he described it. He didn't want to speak to the issue of the Biden administration foster care rule at all, because he told me it could be misinterpreted or taken negatively and create unintended reactions. He was a really nice man, and I liked him. But he felt more shame in asking me he felt more shame in the prospect, the what it would look like if I published his mild remarks, and they were mild, that he felt in calling me, emailing me, a fellow Christian and a journalist, and saying, please don't publish these remarks. That is balance. That is Stockholm Syndrome mindset. He was nice, I liked him, but he was Christian and he was retired, he had no professional risk. This is a Christian organization, it shouldn't have had any institutional risk. And yet the idol of corporate respectability has so infected his mind that he felt that he needed to ask me to do this thing. I'll just say it really bummed me out when I saw that. And it's part of the reason that I have found Cornwall Alliance's example so unusual and so encouraging. Examples of Christian institutions absorbing the unbiblical values of corporate America are innumerable. We have seen the Christian CEOs of companies like Chick-fil-A. I still eat Chick-fil-A, I still like Chick-fil-A, but I'm sorry, as a journalist, I have to tell you, this is true. They have agreed to start DEI divisions while they stop funding Christian charities because those charities adhere to biblical standards on sex and marriage. I hate to tell you that, well, secular companies that have no affiliation with Christianity, like Google and Bank of America, have actually ditched their DEI divisions. Chick-fil-A recently doubled down on this commitment to it. So many Christians who had quietly contacted me, alarmed at what's happening at the Christian colleges or their Christian institutions and organizations, have told me that they believe the compromise is starting in the boardroom and in those C-suite offices. Essentially, you're saying that it's a problem with administrative leadership coming out of corporate America. That's not to disparage business leaders, because I recognize that there were many wonderful Christian business leaders. But I do think we have to acknowledge that this tendency to internalize the ethos of corporate culture and the safetyism of corporate culture can find its way into our Christian ministries when we then take these men and women and place them on our boards and put them at the top of our organizations. So I think what we have to do is start being careful and start choosing these people not just with their impressive resumes, but also for their biblical faithfulness. That needs to be the key test. Thank you. And then finally, I think we need to realize that our willingness to speak provides courage to others to speak. And if you feel like you're alone and you're the only one who thinks something, who believes that creation is stable, who believes that mankind is not capable of destroying it, who believes in wise stewardship and conservation, but who is not alarmed or panicked about what's happening with our weather, if you will speak up, you might suddenly find that other people agree with you. They just didn't know that there were other people out there because the AstroTurf campaign had worked so effectively on them. And that's really what Cal did, if we put it all together. When you take away New America's political jargon of how they put polling coalitions together, what you just see is a Christian who, armed with his Bible and common sense, started studying the issue of climate change through a specifically biblical lens. And he then sounded the alarm that left-wing groups were using high-profile evangelicals to hoodwink ordinary believers to think that they must buy into the climate change agenda in order to be faithful Christians. He just picked up the phone and started calling people. We can all do that. And so all of those who felt deep down that something was off about what they were hearing, and that something was off about these influences coming into their organizations, but were too embarrassed or impressionable to say so out loud, they were emboldened by Cal Weiser's example. Like Moses facing down Pharaoh's magicians, I actually like this comparison better, like Narnia's puddle glove stomping his marsh wiggle foot on the witch's fire. The truth that Weiser spoke through a bucket of ice, a bucket of cold water, on the spell that this infiltration and AstroTurf campaign had worked. And in that way, Cal and Cornwall Alliance are like another hero of fine. And I know that we've had a discussion today from Patricia on Marxism and its relationship to the environmental movement. So I think this is particularly apt way to close. At the end of Frederick Engels' life, Marx's daughter interviewed the co-author with her father of the Communist Manifesto. So this is Marx's daughter interviewing his co-author, Frederick Engels. And she asked him who he disliked most in the whole world. And he answered with a single word: Spurgeon. And that shouldn't surprise us, because Engels believed that a counterfeit form of Christianity could be used to advance the cause of socialism, because both of these ostensibly, both Christianity and socialism, ostensibly address the interests of what he called the laboring and burghers. And a faithful shepherd like Spurgeon, who openly and boldly preached against Marxism specifically, he was specific that Marxism is a counterfeit religion. He stood in the way of Marx and Engels, who were finding great success all over Europe. He reminded the world that mankind's greatest need is not a social project, and it's not power over his oppressors, or forgiveness or his sins. And true Christianity promotes not grievance, but gratitude. It promotes not fear, but peace. And there's little doubt that Marx and Engels knew this. Spurgeon's faithful preaching against godless ideologies protected his country from being seized by Marxists, and they hated it for it. Moses didn't defeat Pharaoh because he had more power, or more money, or a better political strategy. He prevailed because he stood outside of truth and on the authority of God, and that is the same position that the church has always occupied. So maybe be people who love God's creation without worshiping it, who care for our neighbors without manipulating them with political agendas, and who remember that our ultimate calling on this planet, as Cal's letter and his comrade's letter to the National Association of Evangelicals reminded them that we are not here to save the planet, but to proclaim the Savior. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Basham. Ladies and gentlemen, you can stand up and stretch and talk amongst yourselves for just 5 minutes with no couloir, because we are about to begin our panel discussion. If you have a question for Ms. Basham or any of our other speakers, it's not too late. Head over here and write it down for me.